Whether you like it or not, more and more people are talking about a border poll. The arguments over a united Ireland continue.
Ultimately, this could happen quite suddenly and in quite chaotic circumstances.
The debate is often more emotional than rational, no matter what side of the debate you're on.
Even those who persuade themselves that it's imminent seem to have done very little work, on what is the proposition.
But what would a united Ireland look like?
People in the south, there's a huge number of people who just never go, who have no northern friends, who don't read the Belfast Telegraph, who are not part of the conversation at all, and yet think somehow that they can anticipate what's going to happen in Northern Ireland in the event of a border poll.
What about healthcare, education, the economy, even flags?
People who are in the centre ground here are potentially going to vote against Irish unity, with one of the key reasons being the NHS. And actually, in some ways, you could argue, and I do argue this in that section, that is out of date. You're perhaps more likely to live longer and have a better quality of life in this other system.
Can we build a shared future, or are we just too far apart?
Unionists aren't looking for, let's deal with the question. If anything, they're kind of running away from it.
Sam McBride and Fintan O'Toole are among some of the best known journalists on the island of Ireland. They've now written a book on a united Ireland. Both of them have written 2 essays, one in favour of a united Ireland and one against a united Ireland. I'm very privileged to say both Sam and Fintan are here in the studio. Fintan O'Toole, Sam McBride, you're very welcome to the BelTel.
Thanks very much.
Thanks.
I have to say, rarely have I had such distinguished guests on the podcast.
I'm on all the time.
Oh, you are on all the time, but not in this capacity. Not in this capacity, Sam. So I apologise in advance, because today you're not my colleague.
What you mean is that he's very distinguished, which he is.
Yes. Well, what's the story behind this book?
Well, it's something that I was approached about, I think, almost 2 years ago. And when I first got asked about it, my initial reaction was no. I'd done one book in my life. Fintan will tell you how many books he's done, more than I can even remember. But I did one book. It was a heck of a lot of work, but the RHI scandal. And ever since then, I thought, no, I've too much going on. I don't want to do this. And so my initial reaction was no. And then it was the concept of the book that really grabbed me. And it was this idea that you would argue in a book for a united Ireland and then argue the exact opposite of what you had just put down in print against a united Ireland. And that I would do that and that Fintan would do that. And Fintan obviously is somebody who, he's been a journalist for longer than I've been alive. He's extraordinarily experienced. He's obviously from the other side of the border. So there's a different generation. We've got different backgrounds. We work in different jurisdictions. We have different generations. There's all of these things. But actually, what we're trying to do here is honestly look at this question that has vexed our politics. It is at the heart of our politics, and yet which actually, when you look at it in this way, practically, what would it mean? What are the good bits? What are the bad bits? What do we need to worry about? What do we need to get excited about? Actually, you realise we don't do this very often.
Fintan, when did you come on board?
So I think around the same time, so this really came out of a much bigger project that's the Royal Irish Academy are doing with Notre Dame, as they call it in America. I always say Notre Dame because I'm European, but university. And it's a thing called the Aaron's Project. And it's really kind of, I suppose it's, to be frank, a sort of an academic project, which is kind of, doing a lot of excellent research on different areas of, of all Ireland policy. And it has done a kind of tracking series of polls and surveys and focus groups. And so there's a huge amount of material there. And I think they really felt that there was a need for what journalists do, which is we try to make all this stuff kind of comprehensible to the ordinary reader, and also I think a need to just stand back from the sort of the detail a little bit and just think about, as Sam was saying, what are we talking about here? Because it's one of those issues that an awful lot of people have very strong feelings about, but perhaps not an awful lot of people have really thought in detail about what does it mean for the education system? What does it mean for a health system? What does it mean for an economy? There's a whole set of things that are really, really very important. And as Sam said, I don't think either of us would have been terribly interested in being polemicists in this regard. Just to say, I'm gonna write why United Ireland is a great thing, and Sam writes why it's a terrible thing. Much more interesting is to try as honestly as you can to say, like, what are the good arguments on either side, and of course that implies that there are good arguments on both sides. It's sort of the only prejudice here really is a prejudice in favor of saying that we actually do need to be respectful and to accept that people have good reasons for the things that they think, even if the conclusions they draw are the opposite to one another.
So this conversation has started, and we'll talk about this so-called conversation later, because there is a conversation, which wasn't always the case. This was simply a question of national self-determination, which you believed in or you believe it not. And of course, everybody can't have national self-determination, because if one person has it, then the other person doesn't have it, and that's the nature of the game we're in. But I've been a journalist quite a while, and I don't think I've ever read a clinical analysis really of these things, because deep down I think that I'm always reading people's deepest fears or deepest desires, and they can come up with all of the arguments they like, but at the end of the day you're listening to ancestral voices of one way or the other, and people can try and disguise it, but they're not fooling me. But can you prove me wrong? Anybody want to go? Sell it to me?
Lots of what we discover in this, or certainly what I discover in the bits that I wrote, was that there's a lot of out-of-date thinking on both sides on this question. And it's not that it's necessarily always been wrong. It was maybe right 10 years ago, maybe it was right 20 years ago, 50, 80 years ago, but it's not right now. But people still think it's right. So take the NHS, for instance. On the NHS, in the chapter where I'm arguing for Irish unity, I make the point that people in the Republic live longer, significantly longer than people in Northern Ireland, more than 2 years longer. Now, it's very difficult to prove which health system is best. The data is collected in different ways. You can't exactly compare like with like. However, at its most basic, if you had an inferior system south of the border, as once was the case, unquestionably, it is not really credible that people would be living that much longer. Now, there are other factors. There are educational factors. There's prosperity. There are other things that play into people's life expectancy. But is an inferior health system going to keep people alive for longer? So people are potentially in Northern Ireland, people who are in the centre ground here, are potentially going to vote against Irish unity, with one of the key reasons being the NHS. And actually, in some ways, you could argue, and I do argue this in that section, that is out of date. You're perhaps more likely to live longer and have a better quality of life in this other system. Now, you're going to have to pay for it. You might have to pay to go to see the GP. There's things that, for us, on this side of the border, are very countercultural. We're not comfortable with that. And there are good reasons, I think, why in some ways we're not comfortable with that. The idea of having the NHS is a glorious idea, but it's not working in the way it was designed to work.
And we see that in debates now. We see northern politicians saying, well, we need to keep the NHS, or at least until recently, and people tweeting back and say, well, no, I'm not prepared to put up with a lowering of standards. The other, I suppose, philosophical point I have, and Fintan, I'll ask you this first, at least. You're both very welcome to answer every question. Can you really argue both sides of an argument? And if you do, and if you can, how can both sides be true?
Well, because maybe the truth is complex. Maybe it's just sometimes the case that we find ourselves in historical circumstances, right, where there are very, very good reasons to want to make a very profound change, and there are very good reasons for thinking, I don't believe in that change. You're making an emotional appeal, which is based, as you said, on maybe ancestral voices. But does it stack up? And so, I think there are two things here. The normal thing you'd be trying to do, and I'm an opinion columnist, right? I have loads of views about everything. That's what I do most of the time. But this was a sort of different sort of exercise, which is to say, I'm slightly scared, right? Which is, I'm 67. I never thought, to be quite honest, that I would even see a real border poll in my lifetime. There was one a long time ago, but it was a kind of phony one, but a real one. And now I think there's a good chance I will. And there's a good chance that it'll be botched, right? From whatever perspective you come at it at. There's a real chance that this will be a bad referendum. And we all know what bad referendums look like, right? So we know what it is when you just engage emotions, you churn out slogans, people come out with, a few kind of big figures, big headlines, 350 million pounds a week for the NHS, whatever it is, which may or may not be true. And then you've got 4, 5, 6 weeks of TV shows and debates and, all of us and, newspapers going on about it. And then it's done. And then you go, what now? What do we do now? What did that mean? Where was the plan for this? And it's not inconceivable that we could be bounced into this by circumstances. We're in a very unstable situation, I think, both, in the democratic world in general and particularly on these islands. It's not inconceivable that Nigel Farage could be the Prime Minister in 5 years' time. I mean, who would have thought that? So I would normally not want to do this sort of two sides thing, but what I did want to do, and I think what Sam also wanted to do, was to say, actually, there's a kind of civic duty here to say, look, this is what a decent debate would look like. And a decent debate is one in which you can't just say, trust me on this one. You can't just dismiss the people who think a United Ireland would be an immense opportunity for everybody. And you can't just dismiss the people who, for either kind of emotional reasons or for practical reasons, say, I'm just not convinced. I just don't believe that. So it's a kind of duty, I think, to sort of map out in as reasonable a way as you can, as calm a way as you can, what are the issues you would be confronted with in a decent debate, regardless of your views, from whatever side you're coming from. These are the things you would have to actually have some answers to. And so I think in doing this kind of both sides thing for each of us, we've had to ask ourselves as honestly as we can, or answer as honestly as we can, what is going to happen to a health service? What is going to happen with education? What is going to happen to the economy? And I think a lot of us, but both of us from different perspectives, kind of started out by saying, look, you can't take this stuff for granted anymore. You can't just say, I know what I think about this. You might know what you feel about it, but knowing what you feel about it and what you actually think about it are not necessarily the same thing. And I'm coming from, from south of the border down Mexico way, and the general assumption in the south is that it's a good thing. United Ireland's a good thing. Very consistently, about 2/3 of people say they want it. And then you ask them, you put any T&Cs apply, terms and conditions, will you pay more taxes? No. Will you change the anthem? No. Will you change the flag? No. Would it be a good idea to rejoin the Commonwealth to give some sort of expression to, people who have British identity? No. Once you put any kind of concrete...
Yeah, but none of those things, none of those things are certain either. Because sometimes, I've heard those points before. And I've heard those points, and unionists sometimes make those points when they do engage with it. But at the same time is, the only way there can be a United Ireland is if every last unionist vote is cancelled out by a nationalist vote plus one. So the unionist opportunity to say the way things are going to be would be greatly reduced, although they would have a lot of influence. And the other point that other people would make is, you can agree all if you want, and it only lasts until the next election.
Yeah, the one thing I'll say about that is, so you're posing that it's absolutely valid, right? But as a border poll in Northern Ireland, remember there are 2 border polls, right? Mm-hmm. It's not inconceivable that Northern Ireland could vote 50% plus 1 for United Ireland, and the South votes against it, because currently what people are saying is, I won't pay more taxes, for example, right? Now, we know how referendums work. We have a lot of them in the South, and the single most potent slogan in any referendum campaign in the South is, if you don't know, vote no, right? If you're unsure, if you don't know what the hell this is going to mean, just vote no. You can always come back to it, So it's not inconceivable, absurd as it might seem, that Northern Ireland votes for unity and the South votes against. And so the questions in the South are, and I'm not, I'm trying not to, put this either way, but people have to engage with consequences. Right? Maybe the consequences are positive, or the positives outweigh the negatives. but you can't say there are no negative consequences. And also, you can't say that there are only negative consequences. So you have to be able to somehow have some rational process by which you kind of weigh these things.
I'm just going to come back to your question to Fintan first of all, because it's a very insightful question. Can you argue both sides? Is that actually a debate in that sense? And yet, the people who argue both sides are where I was this morning in the High Court in Belfast. Barristers do this every day. Somebody comes to them, it's not their view, they're arguing a case honestly to the best of their ability, and that's a bit like I felt like here. I mean, I haven't been a barrister, I didn't train in law, I have no idea what that actually feels like, but I imagine it's a bit like this. You've got a client, the client here in this chapter is Irish Unity. The client in this other chapter is not actually the union, which is how we think about it on this side of the border. It's actually the status quo, because for people on Fintan's side of the border, it's about keeping the republic pretty much as it is. So these are two actually different constituencies, both of which have to confront this issue. And you can do that. There are very good arguments on both sides. I worried at the start of this, what if I come to this chapter or that chapter, and just my honest view is, there aren't very good arguments. I mean, I'm not going to make things up. I'm not going to embellish things. And I didn't have any difficulty with that at all. There are lots of reasonable arguments. They can't both be right at the same time. But based on what we now know and where we might be at the point when this comes, which in my view might be 10 years away, it might be 20 years away, I don't think it's imminent in that sense. But I don't know. As Fintan says, a Secretary of State who's mad or bad or feckless or whatever it might be could simply call this. There is an element for Parliament in this, but ultimately this could happen quite suddenly and in quite chaotic circumstances.
Clearly, the people who want a united Ireland are Northern nationalists. Neither of you are Northern nationalists, but you're doing this as journalists, as advocates, and trying to set a rational case. Fintan, it's a whole other podcast, as I always say, but whether the South would vote for a united Ireland, I read pieces about that all the time, and it seems to me that the people who don't want a united Ireland say no, and the people who really do want a united Ireland say of course it will. So, and these are the emotions that we're dealing with. Now, the book has not been released, although I have physically have my hand on it here. I was going to ask you to share some details, but I'll just share that with the audience. So, both of you have written a case for a united Ireland, and both of you have written a case against a united Ireland, and then there's a postscript. I have only had this book for 2 hours, and I've had to do a little work in the meantime, but I've done my best because I always try and read the book. I have always read the book. Fintan, your case against a united Ireland, it doesn't seem categorical to me. It seems to be definitely not yet, but am I wrong? The door seems slightly ajar there.
So, I don't think either for or against has any categorical answer, to be quite frank. We're talking about a political construct. Northern Ireland is a political construct, right? One of the first things I try to do in my arguments against Northern Ireland is say, look, a lot of people just say there must be an Ireland because it's natural. It's an island. And the comic irony here is that most people who say that are Irish nationalists who are very sympathetic to both Welsh and Scottish nationalism and say, well, the islands of Britain, that should be divided politically, because they're very different people. And, so when you start examining that, there's nothing natural about this. And also the other thing that's usually the case when you're talking about, sovereignty is the people. There's a people who, as you said, deserve self-determination. But when you start examining that, who are the people? It's a very, very fraught and complex and shifting kind of idea. Even in all the the treaties, like right up to the Belfast Agreement, there's lots of different uses of the people in it. So you can't start by saying that it's a natural, obvious thing from any point of view. What you then have to try to say is, really two sets of questions. One is, are we ready for it collectively? Right? Have we got ourselves into a headspace where we can genuinely engage with this? And secondly, as part of that readiness, do we have roadmaps for what happens to people's lives? This is really serious stuff, right? So it's about, are you or are you not going to be better off or worse off? Is your health service going to be better? What kind of political institutions are you going to have? Who's going to do the policing? Critically, and I think it's one of the critical issues for Northern Ireland, is the education system and outcomes going to be better? And of course, there's no categorical answer to any of those questions, but there are formidable sets of facts that have to be addressed, right? You have to say, so, just to take the obvious one, which is on everybody's mind, which is the economy, it's no good just saying to people, it's all going to be great or it's all going to be disastrous, right? So there's a kind of historical sort of just flipping of this, right? So the initial argument against Irish, home rule, and or any kind of semi-independent Ireland from Ulster Protestants was economic. Right? It was saying this will be an economic disaster. We are one of the richest, most sophisticated, progressive economies in the world, which they were, and we're going to be tied in with this backwater. It's an economic argument. It would be terrible for us. And now people just kind of switch it around, or Irish nationalists switch it around and say, it's all going to be fantastic. Look at how brilliant the southern economy is. The north will just benefit from that, and it's all going to be good, right? Neither of those cases now applies, right? You have to be able to look at it and say, what's the economic cost and what are the potential economic benefits? So obviously, if you're making the case against, you look at the costs. The costs are reckoned credibly for the Dublin exchequer to be around 20 billion euro a year. That's a hell of a lot of money for what's still a small country. It's a hell of a lot of money for a country which still has vast deficits in terms of infrastructural spending, has to put vast amounts of money just into getting its basic facilities up to scratch. And itself, remember, has a growing population, which it has to cater for. So if you're going to be on the other side of that argument, right, you have to turn around and say, okay, well, how can we deal with that? What's the answer to that? And the answer to that would be to say, not to say, I don't recognize your argument or I'm not going to engage with it. It's to say, well, yes, there are significant costs. Let's be honest about this. But it's also reasonable to suggest that the whole might be greater than the sum of the parts. That actually, if you put the two economies together, that actually we have considerable evidence to show from the Belfast Agreement onwards and Brexit and everything, that actually if political change can create economic change, you can make things better, you can make the whole economy bigger. So it's not simply a question of this kind of static thing of saying, here's the costs on the one side. There may well be a growth for everybody, which means more taxation, which means more revenue, which means more opportunity, right? So yes, it's the case, I think, for both of us that we're deliberately not saying, and by the way, this is the side of that argument you should come down on. But what we are saying to people is, from whatever side you're looking at, it's really no good just to say it's all going to be great or it's all going to be doom. That's the box we've been in really for well over a century. But it's not going to be the way this debate should play out. It should play out in a way which actually addresses the questions that ultimately most people want to know, which is what's going to happen to my life.
Sam, your case in favour of United Ireland seems to be more to me as a maybe. It's certainly, you don't articulate an Irish nationalist vision of it. It does seem slightly presumptuous to me, but what was your vision then?
I think I do articulate a vision of it. Whether that's an Irish nationalist vision or not is for other people to decide. But I think that if you're looking at this at its most basic, this is not about bolting Northern Ireland onto the Republic. We've talked about this. We deal with this in the book. There are lots of people on both sides of the border who think that's what Irish unity is. That's what it once was. That was what the idea was in 1921, the idea that the Northern Parliament would simply at some point vote to join with the rest of the island. We've left that behind decades ago. The idea now is that this would be dissolving two states and creating a new country. Now, if you're an optimist, that is an extraordinarily positive and exciting opportunity. Whoever gets to do that, this would be a revolution, if you like, without bloodshed. This is the chance to throw everything up in the air and say, we're going to question everything: education, health, economics, left wing, right wing, where infrastructure goes, who gets rights, how those rights are decided. I mean, everything is up for debate here. Now, if that's not an exciting vision, you're not really excited by the possibilities of politics. This is how democracy is meant to work. That's the positive element of this. We know there are lots of things that could go wrong, and that's why this book, I think, is significant, because we're trying to say, look, by all means, we can do this. But if we're going to do this, my goodness, we need to think about this carefully. Not simply say, you know, let have a border poll by 2030, have it by 2035, whatever date you pluck out of the air. Let's do it. Let's win it at all costs. Let's do what happened in Brexit. You know, it'll all be all right in the night. We know that's nonsense. It always was nonsense. With Brexit, we know exactly where that lands us. And here, as bad as Brexit was, Remainers were never going to set off bombs in the middle of London, as disappointed as they were. Here, for a lot of people, that is a real possibility. We know that's the history of this island on both sides. We can't be flippant about that. We need to look at that responsibly. But there's huge excitement. There's huge possibility here.
If you were for Brexit and you're a Brexiteer, it was a great success.
Well, not necessarily. There are Brexiteers who have honestly confronted this and said, look, I voted for this in good faith. I thought this would be the right thing to do. It's been disastrous. Now, they might not blame themselves for voting for it. They might say that it's been bungled by prime ministers or whatever it might be. But very few people, I think, could honestly look at Brexit and say it has worked.
I have to point out, because the point is often made, well, look what happened with Brexit. And people will point out, yeah, the UK left the European Union.
Chaotically.
Well, chaotically it did, you know, but that was a mess.
It's an absolutely fair point. So, you know, one of the things we have to bear in mind here, right, is that, and it's true of the Brexit thing, and it will also be true of whatever border poll we have, right, which is that this is a question of identity for very large numbers of people. And a question of identity, ultimately, we know that people are willing to take a lot of pain, you know, because it's a zero-sum game. It's about, well, those bastards didn't win, you know, and it doesn't really matter if I also lost something in this course. They suffered more than I did, you know, and that's tribal thinking, and nobody needs to be told that we've still got plenty of that on this island. So it's absolutely the case that there are very significant numbers of people who are not persuadable, right? They're not interested in a book like this because actually it's like, you know, it's a religious faith almost. This is who I am. Now, one of the things I would point out in relation to that, though, is that things change. You know, first of all, gaps open up between people's emotional sense of who they are and their identity, and how much that matters to them. So the intensity with which people hold to some of those icons of their being, you know, can actually change. Really good example of this is the polling in the Republic about a united Ireland is very, very similar to polling in general about the Irish language. If anything, more people would say in polls in the South that the Irish language is an absolutely crucial part of their identity, right? Like something like 75% of people would say this. And then you say, do you speak it? No. You know, are you going to learn it? Well, not really. I don't really have time, you know. So people, you know, people are complex and they're perfectly capable of holding in their heads at one and the same time. This really does matter to me, and it's very important to my identity. And at another level, it's number 15 on the list of things that I really care about. And so you have to accept that there's a hard core of people on both sides of this argument for whom it is number one, or at least if the question was asked, it would be critical. What happened with Brexit was never in the top, or, you know, the European Union was never in the top 10 of issues in any exit polls in any British election. You know, it just didn't feature very much. It was a big issue for tabloids, and people would whinge about it now and again. But actually, when it came down to how people would vote or what they really thought, it wasn't that big an issue. The issue arises when you're forced into a binary yes or no. It'd be lovely to be in a world where we didn't have to be forced into these binaries, you know, but we are sooner or later going to be forced into it. We're going to have to say yes or no. There is no maybe on that ballot paper. And there's also no weighted majority. Some people think that, you know, should be 60%, but that's not the case. The case is it's 50% plus one on both sides, because it's the same mechanism in the South. It's just if there's one more than 50%, that's it. So the real question is, given that this is going to happen at some point, given that that point could be sooner than any of us thinks, we just don't know, we need to separate out the emotion from the rational part of it, and try to say to people that, even if you're going to say, I'm willing to take the cost, so even if it hurts me, I'm going to vote this way.
It's remarkable in that many people have said to me that, well, their identity would survive. Some people have sat here and said, if the union goes, my identity, my British identity would collapse with it. Whereas other people say, oh no, I was British on the Friday and I'll be British on the Monday. And other people will say, and most people of Irish stock in Northern Ireland remain Irish.
Absolutely.
And that remains to be the case. That could be a whole other podcast, and maybe we'll even touch on that. But Fintan, your case for has been, it's quite caveated, let's be honest. And it's for all of these reasons that you do make the case for, but it is highly caveated.
Yes. I mean, I think both of mine are, one thing that is, I think both Sam and I would kind of agree on this, and we've kept our own opinions out of it as much as we can. But I think one thing we would have strong opinions about is that the nature of the for and against is ultimately going to depend hugely on how much preparation is done. How much, what's the time frame? How quickly do we start, planning for this? So, for example, one of the things that comes out very, very strongly in the surveys that the Aaron's studies have done, is people, particularly in Northern Ireland, right, say, the one thing I want to know more than anything else is what's going to happen to the NHS. It's really very, very strong. It's even stronger than the economic argument for people. And at the moment, nobody has an answer, right? Whether you're for it or you're against it. So, Irish nationalists tend to say, we'll have an all-island NHS, it's going to be fantastic, it's going to be world-class. Like how?
And some people say, I'm not paying €50 to see the doctor. And by the way, you just can't see the doctor.
Yeah. But, what's happened really is that both health systems on the islands have become hugely problematic. The South always was, and the North has lost this sort of golden, shining object that it had, which it could shine in everybody's face and say, look at this wonderful thing. And it was a wonderful thing. But the challenge, if you're making a case against a United Ireland, one of the things you need to say is, right, the South has been completely and chronically unable to integrate its own healthcare system, right? Notoriously, no other democracy has a health service where 50%, so everybody's entitled to free hospital services, for example, in theory, yet 50% of people have private health insurance because they don't believe they're going to get what they're entitled to, right? It's a grotesquely illogical, inefficient, unjust system. So that would be the case against, right? You can say, well, come on, do you really expect these people who can't integrate their own health system to take on another health system and integrate it all, which is founded on completely different ideological and organizational principles? The case for would be to say, if we've got two things that aren't working, surely, the challenge of saying we're now in a United Ireland, look at all the benefits we can have from just the practical benefits of sharing resources, but also forcing us. In a way, one of the things that United Ireland would do is give us all a big kick up the behind to say it's not acceptable that people can't get to the doctor. It's not acceptable in what would still be a very rich island. That you've got apartheid effectively, where some people can be taken seriously when they're ill and some people can't. So how you're going to see this is going to depend on, do you take a very kind of cynical view and say, well, actually, the South has had a long time to sort out a lot of these things, hasn't been able to do it, or do you take a more optimistic view, which says, actually, that's precisely the point, that actually partition created two quite sclerotic structures which don't seem capable in and of themselves of creating the kind of reforms that they need, but actually the opportunity of doing something new is the jolt that they both need.
To sum up your argument against Sam, you don't go down that my ancestors took a barren land from a pack of barbarians and turned it into the garden it was today.
Is it a garden?
Well, I read it out on Facebook the other day, funny enough, so people do still argue it. But your
Optimistic.
case seems to be, well, is that fair? I mean, I'm summing up your entire work in that
Look,
sentence.
I mean, there's lots more to it than that, but I think if you were to boil it down and say what is the single most important element of it, yes, that is it. I think that it's much easier on both sides of the border. As Fintan has said, this has worked in other referenda on the south of the border to say if you don't know, vote no. And that has a lot of logic behind it. That's not a stupid thing to say because we know what the status quo is. We know its positives, we know its negatives. We can deal with those for the most part. We don't know exactly what the future is going to be. And when we're told in the likes of the Brexit referendum, don't worry, trust us, here's what it's going to be like, we know that often that's not either honest or the people who are telling that, even if they're being honest, don't have the power to make that happen. So it's very difficult to be absolutely clear as to what the future will be. I mean, if you look at this in simple terms, while it's true that geography is not destiny, there is an element. I mean, there is an element of this that whether we like it or not, and I think there is a conceit often in my generation and people who are younger than me in Northern Ireland in particular, that we are better in some way than our parents and our grandparents' generation, that we have got beyond the tribalism that they had, that people like us see things that they didn't see. We experience things. We're aware of the world in a more diverse way than they were. Some of that's true. That's not entirely untrue. But there's a real danger in that, thinking that we are beyond what our ancestors did. Our ancestors on both sides in this island did barbaric things to each other. And a lot of those were very intelligent people. They were very rational people in some cases. They reacted to things. They overreacted to things. That led to something else. We know how that happened. But there is a danger, I think, that this generation or the generations who will decide this, which may well be, much further into the future than maybe we presently think this might actually come to be decided upon, that they think they're not capable of that. And that's really dangerous. So one of the things I try to come back to in both chapters is history. We cannot ignore history. And there is a danger here that the people who decide this, in some cases, and there's a glorious element to this, may be people who were not even born in this island, who came here from other lands, who have completely free minds, who are not weighed down by the baggage that we have, whether we like it or not. But they're also ignorant of some of the baggage that actually is quite important here. That when this happens, then that's likely to happen. Or when we did that in that year, this is what followed. And so we need to be aware of that. And if this is botched, and that's the dangerous element of this, if it goes through 60-40, I think the risks here are really manageable, frankly. But if that doesn't happen, if this goes through by 1,000 votes, if there's arguments that those votes have been stolen, we know that there's been a history in Northern Ireland in particular of even within nationalism, the SDLP has within the last decade, accused Sinn Féin of stealing votes to win seats. Now, Sinn Féin say that's wrong. They say that's nonsense. Set aside whether that's right or not. That's what people say and believe within nationalism. Imagine how that looks to a unionist who's told this has been stolen. There was foreign money. There were things that were not right here. Look at what Donald Trump managed to convince a very sophisticated electorate in a place which does not have our history of division, which does not have our history of tribalism, where he clearly lost an election. And he did not lose in any way that was underhand. And yet he convinced very intelligent people that he did. And that's dangerous. And we saw what that led to in Washington. That's dangerous because the ancestral memory within unionism is that in circumstances like that, where this is unjust as they see it, they're being taken out of the union against their will, they resort to arms. That's what happened in 1912. That is what, at the centenary of the Ulster Covenant, almost every unionist in Northern Ireland celebrated that. People in churches, people in civic society, people in party politics, liberal unionists, hardline unionists, they saw that as a noble thing, in the same way that nationalists, almost to a person, saw what happened in 1916 as something to be celebrated. And that's dangerous. That's dangerous. We have this glorification of historic violence that could become a reality in different circumstances in the future.
I'm going to stick with you a second, Sam, because there's a number of things I want to pick up on there. And I have to admit, I'm going to slightly play devil's advocate in certain parts because I think that that's what we're doing here. But in a sense, this book, by its physical existence, some unionists might say, that this is part of a conversation in United Ireland, because they say no conversation, no nothing. And it's not just unionists. I spoke to someone from a Dublin background recently. He said, why are we talking about this? You know what I mean? How, even in the last couple of weeks, we see how deeply, deeply divided Northern Ireland is. And yet we keep talking about it because some people think if you keep talking about it, the only cause it serves is the cause of Irish nationalism.
So absolutely, that's what lots of unionists will think about this. There will be a separate unionist criticism of this, I think, which I haven't heard yet, but I'm sure I will, where people will say, this is framed purely in terms of the island of Ireland. This is about an Irish discussion about the future of Northern Ireland. They will say quite legitimately, this is something that has to be considered by the entire union. This is part of the union being broken up. The reason that we framed it in these terms is that these are the terms that it will be decided upon in terms of the Good Friday Agreement. It sets out this is a decision for the people of the island of Ireland. Now, that's not to say that people from the rest of the UK won't have a view on it. They won't be influential. They might come here and campaign. They will come here and campaign. They will argue. Maybe the Prime Minister will support the union. Who knows how that will play out? Ultimately, they won't have a vote. They won't decide this. And the consequences for greater or for ill will be for the people of this island. We are the people who will benefit or who will lose out if this goes badly wrong to a much greater extent than to people on the island of Britain. And so there is a reality to this that we cannot escape. You absolutely can say as a unionist, I don't want to be part of this. I think that's a very logical thing to say for lots of unionists. I think so. I mean, I heard Brendan O'Leary, who has written probably the best book from an academic perspective, somebody who's very, who I think it's fair to say is positive about the idea of Irish unity, who says it has got lots of positive potential. It could be done. Here's how it could be done. But he says it's quite logical for unionists not to engage in this until they've lost, and then absolutely come in and try to say, look, we'll try to negotiate the best that we possibly can get from their perspective. But they cannot pretend that this is not a possibility. There could be a border poll. Right now, if that was called, I think that there is a really considerable reason for unionists to be very confident that they would win. But how would they frame their arguments? What arguments would they face? Would their arguments stack up? Would they make any sense? They need to think about this, even if not publicly, at least privately.
Fintan, I'm sure it would come as no surprise to yourself. I mean, I'm trying to frame this question. I remember a conversation I heard in university where people were discussing several poets in glowing terms, and another young man came along and said, "Oh, they sound a good crack. Will they be out tonight?" And it was explained that they died between 300 and 400 years ago. And the reason why I make that point is because in all our communities, in both unionists and nationalists, the memories go back a long way, and history is a tradition. I'm sure it's like this all over the world. And the reason why I ask you this, because nationalists drive on. But I do sometimes wonder, of all of these campaigns, if people actually think a border poll is imminent, or do they believe that it is necessary to fight for a border poll today to get one in 50 years, even if you yourself are long gone? Do they think that this is simply their part in a very long story?
It's a great question, and I think people can persuade themselves that, this is inevitable, that it's coming, we're going to have it by 2030. And if we did have it by 2030, Irish nationalism is going to win. There's a lot of people have persuaded themselves of that. We have a presidential election going on south of the border at the moment where, certainly the likely candidate who's going to win, Catherine Connolly, is saying, it would be great if it happens during her term of office. I mean, this is 7 years, So people can convince themselves that this is imminent. What surprises me, though, is that even those who persuade themselves that it's imminent seem to have done very little work, on what is the proposition. And it goes back a lot to what Sam's been talking about. But for those who are at all persuadable, which includes certainly the 20% who are the neithers, but I think also includes a significant number of people on both sides who are kind of hovering between some kind of optimism and terror, that it's all going to just go wrong. For those people, they do want to know, what is the proposition? Like, what is going to happen to the NHS? What are the institutions? So the first thing that has to happen, and I think you're absolutely right in your question, which is that this is driven by Irish nationalism, right? unionists aren't looking for, let's deal with the question. They're, if anything, they're kind of running away from it. But it's driven by Irish nationalism, without Irish nationalism negotiating with itself, right? To say, what proposition are we putting forward? One of the extraordinary things that came out of the Aaron's surveys, of voters in the South, is first of all just the sheer number of people in the South, who hadn't been to the North in the previous 5 years. Just don't.
I've met journalists, working journalists, who have never crossed the border in their lives.
Yeah,
they've never went north.
It's staggering. It's not true. People in the North. People in the North do go south. People in the South, there's a huge number of people who just never go, who have no Northern friends, who don't read the Belfast Telegraph, who are not part of the conversation at all, and yet think somehow that they can anticipate what's going to happen in Northern Ireland in the event of a border poll. So that's one of the things that's very strong that comes out of it. The other thing that comes out of it very strongly is a huge number of people in the focus groups they've done, which are also very interesting because you get more detail, right, of what people are thinking, is people saying, oh, are there different versions of I never thought of that. That there might be different models of how United Ireland might work. It's just, it's just United Ireland. That's, it's one thing. And there's a real contradiction here, right, which is, in 1998, over 90% of people in the South voted for the new Articles 2 and 3 in the Irish Constitution, which removed the old-fashioned sort of territorial claim and replaced it with this lovely aspiration, to unite in harmony and friendship all those who share the territory of the islands of Ireland in all the diversity of their identities and traditions. It does not imply a takeover. It does not imply a kind of unitary Irish state, which is just kind of one size fits all. It talks about unity of people rather than of land. And none of that seems to be reflected in what people in the South are saying about a United Ireland, right?
Some people argue that actually Articles 2 and 3 are stronger in this form than they were.
Well, they're stronger as a realistic statement of what an Irish identity might look like in the future, but they're weaker, I think, in the sense that if 90% of people vote for anything, it's probably because they haven't really fully thought through what it might mean. So again, what comes out of the surveys is that there's this sort of surprise that there might be a question about, for example, does a devolved administration continue in Belfast, right? Are we talking about integration or devolution? One of the most fundamental questions about what kind of political structures are you proposing? And the thing that once you get into discussions, with people about this, what they say is, well, I'd like to know those things before I voted. And so this is, I think, part of the process that we're trying to engage with this book, was just to say, look, it's a bit too late after people have voted to say, let's start negotiating now. Yes, of course, there would be negotiations thereafter, and the British government will be centrally involved in that. But Irish nationalists need to know what is their proposition, right? If it's just, what it seems often to be, which is a 32 county, 26 counties, we just add the 6 onto the 26 and everything just goes on as before. That does not seem to be a very realistic proposition. So the case against the United Ireland is to say, look, this is pie in the sky. People haven't even considered the most basic aspects of it. The case for United Ireland is to say, well, of course they haven't, because nobody has really asked them. Nobody's actually properly engaged in this process. And it's when you engage, then I think that's where you will really find out whether people are generous, whether they're willing to say, actually, we accept that we have an obligation. And by the way, it's an obligation under the Belfast Agreement, which does not change with United Ireland, which is not simply to sort of accept that people can still be British. It's to recognise their Britishness. That's the legal obligation, in international law. How do you recognise the Britishness of probably we're still going to have 1 million people or whatever who are going to identify themselves in that way? So this process of thinking is necessary. What you get at the moment is knee-jerk stuff, right? You say, would you change the anthem? No. Would you change the flag? No. However, if you say to people, but, we have to have a proposition around this, if you're talking in terms of Irish nationalism as the we, I think there's a possibility of at least a significant number of people being willing to engage in that in a much more open and creative way.
I have to say, I read the postscript. I read it, the text lives by itself. I found it quite skeptical. And I do think it sticks to maybe the consensus of what people have been saying, what would involve, and, what are we voting for? Some people might say, well, you need something to vote for. Others might say, well, you're trying to prearrange a political future. It is true, I've never heard a conversation like that in any nationalist circles, not in a pub, not in a shop, ever. People have a set view of what a united Ireland is, at least in the north. I do want to ask you both a question, because people see sometimes this conversation, I suppose, in intellectual terms, as the construction of higher barriers. And sometimes we see, in terms of rhetoric from the Republic, so they talk about supermajorities and 2/3 and everything. Now, to use Colm Eastwood's point, yes, of course, 2/3 is better, but the agreement is the agreement. But you've talked about violence there. I do think that some Northern nationalists might be listening to many arguments and said, have we been sold a pup here? Have we been sold a dream of 50% plus one? That's all we needed to get. And now we need to fix the NHS first. Now we have to think about security things. Now we have to get more than 1,000. So people might say, hold on a second here, because, many unionists will not accept this. And people say that. So are we actually looking at repartition or something? There's a whole, I'm not trying to predict the future, but some nationalists might say, hey, 50% plus one, United Ireland, that's what we voted for.
So if you're a Northern nationalist, you absolutely might think that, and it's understandable. And the truth is that if you get 50% plus one and you don't want to fix the NHS in terms of how it's going to look in a new state, if you're not going to fix education and the difficulties of bringing together these disparate systems, if you're not going to fix the question of what the Irish language is going to mean in terms of public life, all of these massive questions, you can do that. But it's going to be a disaster. So, by all means, you can do it. That is the law. You will win and you will get this. What the Brexiteers got, you will get something much worse than that. But that's not in anybody's interest. Whether you're unionist, nationalist, other, coming in from outside, it doesn't matter. You want this place to be a better place for our children than it is for us or for our parents or grandparents. And so the logical thing to do is say, hang on a minute, that's a reasonable point. So let's try to address that. Let's think about that. Let's have a better proposition. Oh, and by the way, that might make more people vote for or against, whichever you prefer, in this outcome. I am a disciple of 50% plus one. I don't think that it's a good outcome if you get that on either side. It's going to be disastrous, but it's the only way this can run. There are parts of the world where territories can't cede or can't secede from their sovereign parliament without a supermajority. But the rules here were always clear. Northern Ireland existed because a majority of its inhabitants wanted that to be so. Now, if you're a nationalist, you'll say the border was drawn artificially to lock in a Protestant majority. We know all that. That's true. But that's not the point. The point is that if that ever didn't, or if that ever ceased to be true, it had to change. People like Ian Paisley Jr. have talked about supermajorities. It's a ludicrous... I've written about this. It's a preposterous idea. It's anti-democratic. It is saying to Republicans who gave up guns, hang on a minute, the minute that you get close to winning, or you might get close to winning, we're going to move the goalposts. It's ludicrous. It's not worth thinking about seriously. Seamus Mallon, a very reasonable, moderate nationalist, floated this idea, I think quite unwisely, near the end of his life. But that doesn't make it right. It's a stupid idea. It's not going to be that. But if it is by 1,000 votes or 10,000 votes or something that people can at least construct an argument that this was unfair or it was swung in dark ways which actually plug into those deep ancestral hatreds, that is really dangerous. And you get some now, I've written about this, and you get some nationalists who will say, this is irresponsible. Why are you raising this? As if I'm the first person in the history of Ireland to raise the idea of people being violent if they don't like a constitutional outcome. The irresponsible thing here is to not think about this. We have to address this. It's not that I am saying in this, I say quite the opposite in this book. We cannot allow he who has the biggest gun a thug to decide what happens here. We can't. So let's deal with it. Let's take it head on. Why is the Irish army farcically ill-equipped to deal with loyalist violence if there was a united Ireland? Why is the Irish Navy at the time when we wrote this book in a position where they had 3 naval vessels? One could go to sea. It didn't have a working gun at that point. This is ludicrous. Loyalists smuggled guns into this island in 1912 by sea. 1914, I think it was, to Larne. That is how this might happen. You need to have a credible deterrent to that. So it's serious. Let's take it seriously.
Yeah, I think a lot of people in the South would say, like, no matter what, we're not gonna crush loyalists by force. I think a lot of people would say that. You know what I mean? We're not going to send a gunboat to Bangor. We don't have a gunboat.
So how do we stop guns getting into the island?
Well, okay.
Do we just give up? I mean, I think it's about addressing these issues. Do we just say it doesn't matter that there's drones that could fly in explosives? I mean, I think if we're going to take this seriously, let's think through all the positive elements of it, and there's loads of them, and think through all the negative possibilities and try to address them. I don't want to end on a dark note. Often when people think about this as unionists or nationalists or on either side of the border, they think in quite apocalyptic terms. If my side loses, wouldn't it be disastrous? Actually, whereas in 1921, if you were a Protestant in Monaghan and you were stuck on that side of the border, it wasn't a good thing from your perspective. If you were a Catholic in West Belfast in 1950, it wasn't a good thing to be there. We have changed from then. Whoever wins when this comes, if it comes, these are 2 of the most sophisticated, egalitarian, wealthy, well-educated states that have ever existed in human history. What actually changes for many people in terms of how they live their lives, as Fintan has said there, will be fairly minimal. That's not to minimise identity, it's really important, but actually it will not be a catastrophic rift for whichever side loses.
Sam Fintan, it's been rational. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.